Hey guys, tonight we slip quietly through the smoky veil of history, back to windswept plains, fluttering yurts, and galloping hooves under a sky full of stars. You're standing ankle-deep in steppe grass, your boots dusted with the trail of 1,000 warriors. Out in the distance, a war drum thuds like a heartbeat. And right in front of you, Genghis Khan is brooding by the fire. He's conquered half the known world, but remembering all his children's names? That's another matter entirely. You're about to meet one of history's most legendary dads, feared by empires, admired by strategists, and, frankly, not winning any best parent mugs. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And feel free to drop your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge behind the caravan, the smell of horse sweat and fermented mare's milk riding the breeze. The Mongol Empire is rising, fast, and so is its founder, Genghis Khan. Or as he was born, Temujin. He's already reshaped much of Asia with his armies and alliances, but his family? That's a campaign with murkier results. Let's start with some numbers. Genghis had at least 4 legitimate sons with his chief wife, Borte, and dozens more with secondary wives and concubines. Some legends, even questionable genetic studies, claim he may have fathered over 1,000 children, though historians still argue whether this is literal fact or just the world's oldest exaggeration. What we do know is that Genghis was an empire builder more than a diaper changer. His sons were assigned huge territories across his expanding realm, from modern-day China to the Caspian Sea. But rather than raising them with bedtime stories and fishing trips, Genghis managed them like military officers, rewarded if loyal, discarded if incompetent. He did, however, show some fatherly instincts when it came to succession. Late in his life, he convened a family council, called a kurultai, to determine which of his sons would take the reins. Imagine a medieval version of Shark Tank, but with more blood feuds and slightly less product pitching. The final choice. Ogdi, the mild-mannered middle son. Not the smartest. Not the fiercest. Just, the most agreeable. Genghis reportedly feared the smarter ones might tear the empire apart competing with each other. So he went with safe. You can almost hear the awkward tension over dinner afterward. And yet, despite this planning, the family drama that followed would make even the Kardashians look well-adjusted. After Genghis's death in 1227, his descendants immediately fell into a whirlwind of rivalries. Brothers plotted, cousins rebelled, and territories splintered into competing khanates. Sure, Genghis could conquer cities with flaming arrows and siege engines, but apparently couldn't teach his sons to play nicely. Here's a fringe detail you might enjoy: Mongol noble children were raised by wet nurses and nannies who sometimes held higher status than their birth mothers. These caretakers were often fiercely loyal, so much so that when one of Genghis's grandsons rose to power, he brought his childhood nanny with him to court and gave her a royal title. You've heard of motherly love, but medieval Mongol nanny power? That's another level. It's not that Genghis didn't love his kids. He likely did, in his own distant, Mongol warlord way. But for him, parenting wasn't about bonding. It was about legacy. About control. About spreading his bloodline like wildfire across Eurasia. Family dinners. Tri-military campaigns. Hugs. Replace those with hunting expeditions. There's even one account of him gifting his son a palace, after ordering the mass execution of everyone who lived on the land. You know, just in case his boy wanted a bit more room to stretch out. But what's fascinating, and maybe a little tragic, is that Genghis's obsession with conquest actually undermined the very family he was trying to empower. By raising sons as governors and generals rather than sons, he baked conflict into their future. And that future arrived fast. Ogidi, his chosen heir, drank himself to death. Another son, Joki, was constantly suspected of being illegitimate, a rumor that Genghis never really addressed, which probably didn't help the whole sibling dynamic. And then there's Talyui, the youngest, who never officially ruled but ended up being the ancestor of Kublai Khan, who, spoiler alert, did way more with the family business than any of his brothers. Historians still argue whether Genghis intended for his empire to stay united forever, or whether he just hoped his kids would figure it out. Either way, they didn't. Within a century of his death, the Mongol Empire fractured like a dropped porcelain bowl. And yet, somehow, his legacy survives. In 2003, a team of geneticists published a study suggesting that nearly 1 in 200 men alive today carries a Y chromosome pattern possibly originating from Genghis himself. That's about 16 million people. Which means, statistically, he's the worst dad, and maybe the most successful one too. So next time you're having a tough day, just remember, at least your dad probably didn't use horseback archery and geopolitical chaos as bonding tools. You march on into the darkness, the moon casting silver streaks across the grasslands. A howling wind tugs at your coat. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf cries out, maybe it's howling for a better family dynamic. You chuckle softly, your breath clouding in the cold night air. You keep moving, boots crunching over the gravel-strewn path of time, until the step fades and gives way to the holy dust of the Levant. The dry wind carries the scent of myrrh, sweat, and someone's very bad idea of a crusade. And right there, glittering in the sun atop a well-armored horse, is Richard the Lionheart, King of England, leader of the Third Crusade, and, quite frankly, one of the most absentee dads in the medieval world. Now, let's get one thing out of the way. Richard wasn't always supposed to be king. He was the third son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, yes, that Eleanor, the savvy, sword-wielding duchess who probably parented more wisely than any king in this entire script. Richard was tall, dashing, multilingual, and excellent at swinging a sword. He was also, deeply disinterested in raising a family. And yet, in 1189, he took the English throne. Not long after, he basically peaced out. Like, fully ghosted the kingdom. He spent 6 months in England over a 10-year reign. That's not an exaggeration, it's an actual statistic. You probably spend more time each year with your houseplants than Richard did ruling a country or visiting any potential children. Let's talk marriage. Richard was wed to Berengaria of Navarre. Romantic, right? Well, maybe not. She didn't attend the wedding, he sent someone else to pick her up. Then he left her in Sicily for the entire Third Crusade. They may have had no children. Historians still argue whether the marriage was ever consummated at all. And here's a quirky tidbit, Berengaria is the only English queen who never set foot in England while her husband was alive. That's not just distant, that's medieval ghosting. Richard's real passion. The Holy Land. Swords. Siege engines. And long, sweaty marches through enemy territory. He was obsessed with proving himself on the battlefield, often leading charges personally. There's a famous story of him taking down a Saracen knight with one swing of his longsword, classic Lionheart. His armies revered him. His enemies respected him. But his kingdom? His family? They barely knew him. Meanwhile, back home, his younger brother John was busy being, well, John. Sneaky, manipulative, slightly cartoonish in his villainy. While Richard waged war in Jerusalem, John plotted, bribed nobles, and quietly prepared to make England his own. That's the royal equivalent of your little brother changing the locks while you're on vacation. Then there was the whole, captured and held for ransom, episode. After the crusade, Richard was kidnapped in Austria. The ransom demand? 150,000 marks, about 3 times the average yearly income of the English crown. To raise that kind of money, taxes were hiked, royal jewels pawned, and even churches emptied of their silver. The English people paid to get him back, and when he finally returned, he treated them to a quick tour and headed right back to the continent to fight the French. You'd think that near-death experiences might inspire a touch more fatherly reflection. Maybe a walk in the garden with an heir. But no. Richard had no known legitimate children. Some historians whisper that he may have fathered a few illegitimate kids, but even that's up for debate. It's entirely possible that the Lionheart, for all his roaring, left no personal legacy behind. And yet, oddly enough, he still managed to inspire centuries of myths. Robin Hood tales often feature Richard as the noble, rightful king returning to save the realm from evil John. That's rich, considering he spent most of his life abroad, emptied the royal treasury, and never showed much interest in the day-to-day welfare of his people. Honestly, it's like your dad winning Parent of the Year while never showing up for your birthday parties. Still, he was undeniably brave. Charismatic. A master tactician. He could win battles with terrifying precision, but build emotional bonds? Not so much. If you're looking for bedtime stories, Richard probably skipped straight to the part where someone gets stabbed. Here's a lesser-known nugget. One of his closest companions on the crusade was a young boy named Humphrey, who reportedly carried Richard's banner and shared his tent. The nature of that relationship has long been speculated about. Some scholars suggest a kind of mentorship, others a deeper bond. Whatever the truth, Richard seems to have invested more emotion in his military brotherhood than any parental role. And here's the kicker: when he finally died in 1199, shot by a crossbow bolt during a minor siege in France, he left the throne not to a beloved son or trusted heir, but to John. Yes, that John. The one he'd previously warned people not to trust. So in the grand ledger of fatherhood, Richard ends up as a figure of glorious failure. He wins battles, writes stirring letters, and sculpts a chiseled place in medieval lore, but forgets to leave behind a son, a legacy, or even a family that doesn't loathe each other. You wander deeper now, stepping over crumbled crusader stones and fading banners, the smell of old incense lingering in the breeze. You glance back once, half expecting to see Richard charging over a hilltop, sword raised, armor gleaming. But he's long gone, his empire scattered to the winds, and his family, well, they've got plenty of drama waiting ahead. The wind changes again, brushing past crumbling battlements and into a richly tapestried hall echoing with Latin chants and clinking goblets. You're not in a battlefield now, you're inside the mind of a medieval micromanager. Yes, you've arrived in the realm of Charlemagne, Emperor of the Romans, King of the Franks, conqueror of half of Europe, and self-declared full-time dad of a truly exhausting number of children. Charlemagne, let's call him Charles if you're into that casual, bedtime familiarity, was not just a king. He was the king. The man who more or less jump-started medieval Europe by uniting fractured kingdoms and convincing the Pope to crown him emperor on Christmas Day in 800. You'd think that kind of power would leave no room for parenting. But Charles? Oh no. He was very hands-on. And also a little intense. You walk past a velvet curtain and suddenly you're surrounded by the sound of quills scratching and children reciting prayers. Charlemagne's palace wasn't just a court, it was part royal academy, part military prep school, and part overachieving family reunion. He had at least 18 children by multiple wives and concubines, though some estimates go higher. And he personally supervised their education like the world's most ambitious homeschool dad. He insisted they learn Latin, Greek, and rhetoric. They studied mathematics, astronomy, and swordsmanship. Daughters, too, he didn't leave the girls out. In fact, he adored his daughters so much that he refused to let any of them get married. Ever. And yes, that's as weird as it sounds. Historians still argue whether this was a move to keep political alliances from threatening his power, or simply the result of a papa bear with serious attachment issues. Either way, his daughters were stuck at home, often having affairs with noblemen right under Charles's nose. He pretended not to notice. When one of them got pregnant, the entire court would awkwardly not mention it, like one big medieval family dinner where everyone's just politely ignoring the scandal under the roast goose. There's even a quirky tidbit that Charles liked to have his daughters sit beside him at banquets and accompany him on royal tours. Some accounts describe them as musically talented, often performing in front of guests. Imagine being a war-hardened Saxon emissary, walking into the palace expecting a strategic meeting, and instead getting a flute solo by Princess Bertha. Charlemagne, for all his efforts, couldn't resist running his kids' lives like a military campaign. He arranged training, marriages, for the boys, and governorships. When his oldest son Pepin the Hunchback rebelled against him, Charles shaved the boy's head and threw him in a monastery. Harsh? A little. But hey, it's parenting in the 9th century. Still, Charles had big dreams for succession. He wanted to divide his empire neatly between 3 sons, Charles the Younger, Louis the Pious, and Pepin of Italy. Everyone would get a piece, and they'd all get along like polite neighbors in a feudal cul-de-sac. Spoiler alert, that didn't happen. Charles the Younger died suddenly in 811. Pepin of Italy had already died in 810. That left Louis the Pious, the least prepared and most, well, pious of the bunch. Louis inherited everything when Charlemagne died in 814, and immediately struggled with the job. Let's just say he didn't get his dad's knack for managing people or suppressing noble revolts. Historians still debate whether Charlemagne's obsessive parenting style helped his kids thrive or left them burdened and lost once dad was gone. Was he grooming future emperors or just micromanaging them into dependency? You duck through another corridor of memory, and there he is, Charlemagne himself. Towering, bearded, and wearing a robe that screams holy authority with just a touch of sparkle. He's watching his children recite prayers before dinner, correcting their Latin pronunciation with the gentleness of a man who once ordered the decapitation of 4,500 Saxons. Because yes, let's not forget, this was a man who could be terrifying. While doting on his children and pushing for cultural revival, he also waged brutal campaigns against the Saxons and the Avars. His empire expanded by sword point, and rebellion was met with swift and violent suppression. In one famous incident, he forced tens of thousands of people to convert to Christianity, or else. Not exactly bedtime story material. And yet, he wrote poetry. Studied the stars. Had a fondness for bathing. Kept a small menagerie. And spent long hours with his family, grilling tutors and quizzing his kids. You get the sense he genuinely wanted them to succeed. But he just couldn't quite let go. One fringe fact for you, Charlemagne never really learned to write. He could read fluently, but despite years of practice, he struggled to make his fingers form letters. He reportedly kept a writing tablet under his pillow to practice at night. Imagine that, an emperor who controlled half of Europe, lying awake at night trying to trace out his own name. You pause, watching the flickering torchlight cast dancing shadows on polished stone. Charlemagne is fading now, his voice echoing through the great halls of Aachen. His dreams of a united Christian empire will shatter in the hands of his heirs. His children will feud, his empire will splinter, and the neat little succession plan will dissolve into centuries of conflict. But for one moment, you glimpse him as something more than just a king. A tired, earnest father trying, desperately, to turn legacy into love. And maybe making a royal mess of both. You step out of Charlemagne's cloistered halls and into a colder, darker place, emotionally and literally. Thick fog clings to the damp English countryside, and the air smells like horses, wet wool, and brewing rebellion. You're in the company of Henry II, one of England's most powerful medieval monarchs, and possibly its most catastrophically dysfunctional dad. Picture this: you're king of a vast empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, married to the indomitable Eleanor of Aquitaine, and blessed with 4 strong sons. Sounds like a solid family dynasty in the making, right? Wrong. Henry managed to raise sons who hated him so deeply, they went to war against him. Multiple times. As in, real swords, real castles, and real betrayal. But let's rewind. Henry wasn't always a cautionary tale in royal parenting. Early in his reign, he was known for restoring order to a chaotic England. He restructured courts, streamlined taxes, and laid the foundation for English common law. Not too shabby. But when it came to his own household, less organized. Far less. His marriage to Eleanor started out passionate. Together, they had 8 children, including the 4 sons who would come to define Henry's legacy: Henry the young king, Richard, yes, that Richard the Lionheart, Geoffrey, and John. You remember John, the guy who inherited the throne after Richard went off crusading and never bothered producing a kid. Henry, like many medieval rulers, thought he could manage his sons by granting them titles, lands, and promises of future power. Instead, he sowed a family garden of rivalry. He crowned his oldest, Henry the young king, while still alive, an unusual move, intended to solidify succession. But then he refused to give him any real authority. It's like handing your kid the keys to a car and telling him he can sit in the driveway forever. Not exactly a recipe for peace. Historians still argue whether Henry was a master strategist or simply short-sighted. Either way, the results were explosive. In 1173, his sons, egged on by their mother, Eleanor, launched a full-scale rebellion. That's right, Queen Eleanor sided with her sons against her husband. It was a royal family civil war. Henry the young king, Richard, and Geoffrey teamed up with foreign armies and marched against their father. Eleanor got caught trying to flee and was promptly locked in a castle for the next 16 years. Mother of the Year? Maybe. Incredibly fed up with Henry? Absolutely. Here's a quirky side note: Henry the young king, despite being crowned and rebelling like a champ, never actually ruled. He died of dysentery in 1183 during another rebellion, having spent most of his adult life demanding power he never got. And then there was Richard, beloved by bards and Hollywood alike. Henry tried to get him to relinquish Aquitaine, his mother's inheritance, which was like asking a lion to hand over its mane. Richard refused. Furious, Henry encouraged Richard's younger brother, John, to undermine him. This was the royal version of picking a favorite and waving it in your other children's faces. Predictably, it backfired. Richard allied with the King of France and attacked Henry's lands. That's right, another war. This one ended with Henry defeated, sick, and alone. As he lay dying in 1189, he received the final insult: his beloved John, his supposed loyal son, had betrayed him too. Henry asked for a list of those involved in the rebellion. When he heard John's name, he reportedly turned his face to the wall and said, "Now let everything go as it will. I care no longer for myself, nor for the world." Ouch. Now let's talk family dinners, assuming they ever had one. You picture Henry sitting at a long wooden table, grumbling over his mead while half his sons plot his downfall between bites of roast boar. Even by medieval standards, the Plantagenet family dynamic was a flaming disaster. And yet, Henry wasn't cruel in the traditional sense. He was impatient, temperamental, and obsessive, sure. But he genuinely tried to secure futures for his sons. He just couldn't let go of the reins long enough for them to feel trusted. Everything was a strategy. Everything a negotiation. Love came with a clause and an army attached. A lesser-known fact. Henry was a restless traveler. He rarely stayed in one place for more than a few days. Some historians say this constant motion made him a more effective ruler. Others suggest it left his children with a distant, wandering father figure whose affection could only be earned through loyalty, or rebellion. One fringe theory. Some scholars believe Henry suffered from what we'd now call bipolar disorder, explaining his manic energy, mood swings, and erratic decisions. Of course, in the 12th century, there were no diagnoses. Just chronicles full of shouting, marching, and dramatic oaths. You shuffle through the cold halls of Chinon Castle, where Henry finally breathed his last. The air is thick with mildew and regret. You see ghosts of arguments past, Richard slamming doors, John whispering conspiracies, Eleanor pacing in her tower. The empire Henry built remains. But the family he raised? Left scattered and scorched. In the end, Henry II ruled half of Western Europe but lost nearly all of his sons to hatred, conflict, and betrayal. The man who tried to hold the threads of an empire in his hands couldn't keep his own family from unraveling. As you walk away from the crumbling walls, you hear the echo of his footsteps, restless, pacing, planning, always moving, even in death. Maybe he's still trying to fix what went wrong. The fog thickens as you leave the English drizzle behind, and now the air turns sharp, metallic, tinged with ash and something else, something more unsettling. You're deep in the Carpathian Mountains now, surrounded by craggy peaks and pine forests that creak and groan in the wind like they're trying to whisper warnings. You pull your cloak tighter. Because tonight, you're walking beside Vlad the Impaler, the man who inspired Dracula, and who may just be the most terrifying father in medieval history. If Genghis Khan forgot his kids' names, and Henry II micromanaged his sons into rebellion, Vlad had his own parental style, disciplined through absolute fear. Cozy. Born in 1431 in Transylvania, yes, that Transylvania, Vlad III was the son of Vlad II Drakel. The name Drakel came from his membership in the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric group dedicated to defending Christianity from the Ottomans. And yes, that means little Vlad was literally son of the dragon, or as folks like to whisper, son of the devil. Depends on the tone. His childhood? Not exactly nurturing. At age 11, he and his brother Radu were handed over as hostages to the Ottoman Empire, part of a political hostage exchange. While Radu adapted and even befriended the Sultan's court, Vlad did not take kindly to captivity. Instead, he stewed in silence, absorbing court politics and, possibly, refining the art of revenge. Historians still argue whether Vlad's brutality was a direct result of his harsh upbringing, or whether he was always wired a little differently. Either way, when he returned to Wallachia as an adult, he ruled like a man determined never to be powerless again. Now imagine being his child. Vlad had at least 2 sons, possibly more, but only one, Minia, stands out in historical records. Known later as Minia the Bad, which is frankly not great branding, this poor lad had to grow up under the looming shadow of a father who was famous for impaling people. As in, sharpening a giant wooden stake, placing the enemy on it, and letting gravity do the rest. Slowly. Often for days. It's said that Vlad once invited a group of rebellious boyars, nobles, to dinner, asked them politely how long their families had served the crown, and then had them all stabbed and impaled before dessert. No one dared ask for a takeaway box. Another charming anecdote. Vlad reportedly left a golden cup out in the open in one of his cities to test his citizens' honesty. No one touched it, for years. That's the level of fear he inspired. And that's the man teaching you how to clean your sword and say your prayers. Now, Vlad didn't ignore his children, he protected them. But in the way a bunker protects you, not with warmth, but with paranoia. His court was a place of constant tension. One wrong move, one misstep in etiquette, and, well, let's just say you might be sleeping with your eyes open. Minia, growing up in this atmosphere, learned a thing or two. When Vlad was finally killed in battle, possibly betrayed by his own men, Minia tried to rule in his father's style. Spoiler, it didn't go well. He was driven from power, hated by his subjects, and eventually assassinated in a church. During Lent. So yes, the family business didn't exactly thrive in the long run. Still, there's something tragic beneath the iron mask. Vlad ruled a land squeezed between empires, the Ottomans to the south, Hungarians to the north. He was always outnumbered, always under threat. Some historians suggest that his brutality was a form of psychological warfare, an attempt to terrify enemies into submission rather than face constant war. Others argue it was just who he was. A quirky fringe tidbit. Vlad was a stickler for hygiene. He reportedly hated dirt, disorder, and laziness. Visitors to his court noted how clean everything was, and how deathly quiet. No one wanted to be noticed. Not even the pets. As a father, it's hard to imagine bedtime stories or piggyback rides. Instead, you picture Minia being taught to recite the names of enemy families from memory, practicing the placement of stakes in the garden, and learning that mercy was not a virtue, but a weakness. And yet, even Vlad wasn't immune to sentiment. One tale suggests that, during his brief imprisonment by the Hungarian king, he painted religious icons and letters to his children. Softening? Maybe. Or just scheming. What's certain is this: Vlad the Impaler's legacy survives not through love or lineage, but through fear. His children inherited his name and his enemies, but not his power. And his legend, half hero, half monster, still casts a long shadow. You walk now through a quiet forest clearing. The moonlight glints off something buried beneath the soil. Maybe a stake. Maybe a crown. The wind rustles the leaves with a whisper that sounds suspiciously like, "Remember your training, Minia." You hurry on. You descend now from the Carpathians into the golden hills of 13th century Spain, where dusty libraries whisper in Latin and kings fancy themselves poets. The air here is dry and sun-warmed, the stones of the old castles still humming from the heat of the day. A lute plays softly somewhere in the courtyard, and a scholar with ink-stained hands naps under an olive tree. You've arrived in the court of Alfonso X of Castile, known as El Sabio, the Wise. Wise he was. But when it came to parenting, let's just say, the scrolls were more organized than the royal nursery. Alfonso was king of Castile, Leon, and Galicia from 1252 to 1284, and his brain was stuffed with more knowledge than a medieval monastery. He loved astronomy, law, languages, and, unusually for his time, Jewish and Muslim scholarship. He gathered scholars from all three Abrahamic religions in his court to work on legal codes, star charts, and encyclopedias. It was like an early medieval TED Talk that never ended. But while Alfonso was revolutionizing law and culture, his family was unraveling faster than an old tapestry. He had 11 legitimate children, plus a handful of illegitimate ones, and tried managing them like chapters in one of his manuscripts, tidy, footnoted, arranged just so. It didn't work. His oldest son, Ferdinand de la Cerda, was supposed to inherit everything. Smart, capable, and unusually patient for a royal heir. But then, in 1275, Ferdinand died unexpectedly while on campaign. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the court, and straight into Alfonso's succession plan. With his heir gone, Alfonso faced a thorny problem: should the crown go to Ferdinand's sons, his grandsons, or to his next oldest surviving son, Sancho? Now here's where Alfonso proves he might be a brilliant king, but not a brilliant father. He insisted on sticking to his original plan: the grandsons would inherit. To him, it was simple logic. Primogeniture, the right of the eldest line. That's what the law said, and Alfonso, as the compiler of the famous Siete Partidas, a medieval legal code, wasn't about to go back on his own rules. But Sancho was not having it. Sancho, ambitious and charismatic, immediately began gathering noble support. His father's insistence on bypassing him felt like betrayal. So what did Sancho do? He rebelled. Of course. It's practically a family tradition at this point. He raised an army against his own father and declared himself heir by force. And the nobles backed him, because they feared a child ruler would weaken the realm. The final insult. In 1282, the Cortes, a sort of proto-parliament, declared Sancho the rightful successor, while Alfonso was still alive. Talk about being voted out by your own kingdom and your own son. You can almost see Alfonso sitting at his desk, surrounded by parchment and scrolls, hearing the news and setting down his quill with a sigh. Not angry. Just tired. Maybe a little heartbroken. Now, scholars still debate whether Alfonso's decision was noble or naive. Was he a principled man trying to follow the law, or a rigid intellectual who couldn't adapt to realpolitik? What's certain is that he spent his final years isolated, underfunded, and increasingly bitter, watching his own son rule in all but name. And what of those grandsons? The ones he tried to protect? They were quietly sidelined after Alfonso's death. Sancho, once he became king, showed little mercy. Now here's a quirky detail: Alfonso was deeply obsessed with astrology. He funded translations of Arabic star charts and believed celestial events influenced political ones. Some even say he delayed military decisions to consult horoscopes. So it's a strange irony that while he looked to the stars for guidance, he completely missed the growing rebellion under his own roof. One fringe fact. In his later years, Alfonso claimed the Pope had no authority to approve Sancho's succession. He sent angry letters to Rome, trying to invalidate his son's claim. The papacy, perhaps wisely, ignored him. And where does all this leave us? With a father who tried to rule with reason and scholarship, only to be undone by emotion and ambition. He raised sons with education and opportunity but couldn't give them the one thing they wanted most: recognition. His own legal brilliance trapped him. His moral high ground became a lonely summit. You walk through the dusty alcoves of Toledo's royal court, past half-translated books and star maps, where the scent of ink still hangs in the air. Alfonso's legacy lives in law, in learning, in luminous manuscripts. But his family? Scattered. Divided. A kingdom passed down in anger rather than wisdom. And yet, in the hush of the night, you feel a glimmer of sympathy. Alfonso, surrounded by knowledge, tried to write the perfect future. But people, especially sons, aren't ink on parchment. They smudge. They rebel. They ruin clean margins. You step out onto a stone balcony. The stars he once charted blaze above you. Orion. Cassiopeia. Mars hanging low. They haven't moved. Alfonso would be comforted by that, at least. The stars fade, replaced now by candlelight and velvet curtains heavy with incense and secrets. You are no longer among scholars or kings with law books. You're in the Vatican, Rome, 15th century, and things are complicated. Because tonight, you're pulling up a gilded chair at the family dinner table of Pope Alexander VI, perhaps the only man in history to earn a reputation as both supreme pontiff and shockingly bad father. Let's address the holy elephant in the room first. Popes weren't supposed to have children. Celibacy was the rule, at least in theory. But Rodrigo Borgia, Alexander's real name, never let canon law get in the way of personal ambition. Or romance. Or nepotism so aggressive it practically needed its own papal bull. So, how many children did he father? At least 7, acknowledged. Possibly more, depending on how deep you want to dig through the Vatican's velvet-draped skeleton closet. His most famous offspring: Cesare Borgia, the ambitious warlord-priest hybrid, and Lucrezia Borgia, whose name still conjures up whispers of poison rings and incest, although modern historians have tried to clean up her reputation. A little. You move through the gilded corridors of the Apostolic Palace, past frescoes of angels that probably blushed themselves off the wall when Alexander came to power. Imagine being the child of a pope in a time when the church ruled both souls and armies. Weirdly privileged, highly politicized, and very likely to end up stabbed in a banquet hall. Let's start with Cesare. Groomed for the church at first, he became a bishop at 15 and a cardinal at 18. But Cesare was no man of the cloth. He preferred armor to robes and ambition to obedience. When his brother Giovanni was mysteriously murdered, stabbed in the Tiber, how original, rumors swirled that Cesare had arranged it. Why? To inherit his brother's secular titles and get out of the church. Honestly, in this family, it's hard to tell if that's betrayal or just Tuesday. Historians still argue whether Alexander enabled Caesare's worst impulses or simply lost control of him. But one thing is clear: he used his children like chess pieces. Lucrezia was married off 3 times for political gain. When one of her husbands, Giovanni Sforza, became inconvenient, the Borgia family annulled the marriage by declaring he was impotent. Publicly. In court. Nothing says, "Thanks, Dad," like global humiliation and forced celibacy. And yet, Alexander clearly loved his children. He didn't hide them. He promoted them. He flaunted them. In an age where most popes pretended to be above such earthly attachments, Alexander practically declared, "World's greatest dad," on his papal tiara. He gave Cesare command of armies and pushed for him to carve out a Borgia duchy in central Italy. At one point, Alexander's influence had placed family members in top positions across the church, the nobility, and the military. He was the original, networking dad, if by networking you mean politically engineering a small dynasty while still wearing robes covered in gold thread. Here's a quirky tidbit for your next trivia night. Alexander once hosted a Vatican banquet known as the Banquet of Chestnuts, where 50 courtesans were allegedly hired to entertain high-ranking clergy in less than holy ways. Whether the story's completely true or Renaissance tabloid fodder, we may never know. But the fact that it exists in the archives gives you a sense of how far from saintly this father figure strayed. And there's a fringe fact: some scholars now believe Alexander was more administrative than lascivious. His real sin? Treating the papacy like a family business. Not the first pope to do it, but arguably the most flamboyant. Nepotism, from nepos, Latin for nephew, was rampant in his time, and nephews often meant secret sons. Alexander just skipped the secrecy. But like all high-stakes family dramas, the Borgia story ends with betrayal, poisonings, and tragic falls. Caesare's military campaign eventually collapsed, Lucrezia found herself widowed and remarried like a pawn in a political storm, and Alexander himself died in 1503, possibly from poison, though some historians say it was just malaria. Either way, he left behind a splintered legacy and children who were now very vulnerable without their father's divine protection. You walk past his tomb now, cold marble, barely touched by time. There are no tearful epigraphs, no tender inscriptions. Just a name. Rodrigo Borgia. A man who sat on the throne of St. Peter and used it to build a legacy of blood, ink, and whispered scandal. And his children? They became infamous not because of who they were, but because of who raised them. Cesare, the blueprint for Machiavelli's The Prince. Lucrezia, painted as a femme fatale and victim in equal measure. All under the long, heavy shadow of a father who gave them power but not peace. As you leave the Vatican's twisted corridors, you feel the contrast of candlelight and cold marble at your back. The scent of old incense clings to your clothes. And somewhere in the dark, a chorus of whispers rises, not prayers, but secrets, echoing down the centuries from a family that ruled the world, and lost each other in the process. From the marble corridors of the Vatican, you cross into colder, flatter terrain, rutted roads, gray skies, and bitter winds that slap against your cheeks like unpaid debts. Welcome to 16th century Russia, where warmth is rare, mercy rarer, and Tsars rule not just with iron, but with paranoia dripping from every royal decree. You're walking now beside Ivan IV of Russia, better known as Ivan the Terrible, a man whose idea of fatherhood would make even Vlad the Impaler raise a concerned eyebrow. Ivan wasn't always terrible. In fact, he started off, tragically sympathetic. Crowned Grand Prince at the age of 3 after the death of his father, and then essentially abandoned to a power-hungry court full of scheming boyars. He was beaten, isolated, left to play with small animals, until those animals, too, were taken away or killed in front of him. If ever a monarch was molded by trauma, it was Ivan. Historians still debate whether Ivan's later descent into brutality was inevitable or triggered by key events, like the death of his beloved first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, whom he may have genuinely loved. After her passing, he grew erratic, paranoid, and cruel. And for his children? That meant growing up in a palace that felt more like a pressure cooker than a home. He had multiple children, but the most infamous parenting moment in Ivan's life, and arguably one of the most tragic in Russian history, came in 1581. Picture this: Ivan's heir, Ivan Ivanovich, was a strong, competent young man, groomed for leadership, respected by nobles, and one of the only people brave enough to stand up to his father. One day, he confronts his father about beating his pregnant daughter-in-law. Heated words. Shouts. And then Ivan, in a fit of rage, strikes his own son in the head with a staff. Hard. The younger Ivan collapses, blood pouring from his temple. He dies a few days later. The horror in Ivan's eyes as he realizes what he's done is frozen forever in one of Russia's most famous paintings, Ivan the Terrible and His Son, by Ilya Repin. In it, Ivan's eyes are wild, his hands clutching the lifeless body of his son. A king and a father, destroyed by the same hand. Was it an accident? A moment of madness? Historians still argue. Some suggest he meant only to strike in anger and misjudged the blow. Others think it was a culmination of years of suspicion, control, and a need to dominate even his own bloodline. What's certain is that the result was catastrophic. With his heir gone, Ivan was left with Fyodor, a gentle, pious son unfit for rule. After Ivan's death, Fyodor would ascend to the throne, technically. But it was really Fyodor's brother-in-law, Boris Godunov, who held the reins, paving the way for Russia's time of troubles, a period of famine, rebellion, and impostors claiming to be Ivan's lost heirs. One quirky, lesser-known tidbit: Ivan loved books. He was deeply literate, even started the first printing press in Russia. He wrote letters to foreign leaders, poetry, and theological essays. He could be eloquent and philosophical, when he wasn't, killing people. It's an odd duality, the scholar czar who wrote sermons by candlelight, then ordered entire towns burned by morning. And speaking of towns, let's not forget Novgorod, a city Ivan accused of plotting treason. In 1570, he marched on it with his personal death squad, the Oprichniki, and carried out a massacre so horrific that contemporary accounts speak of babies thrown into rivers and churches filled with bodies. You can't help but wonder, how did his children process this? How do you reconcile bedtime stories with public executions? There's a fringe theory, too, that Ivan suffered from mercury poisoning, possibly due to the medicines prescribed after Anastasia's death. High mercury levels can cause paranoia, tremors, and violent mood swings. His erratic behavior, emotional volatility, and wild outbursts may have had roots not only in trauma but in literal toxicity. But diagnosis doesn't equal absolution. Ivan's approach to fatherhood was rule through fear. He taught his children to kneel, to obey, to be strong, but never to be safe. Even in moments of tenderness, there was tension. The walls of his palace echoed with suspicion. And while Russia grew in size and centralized power under his reign, his own house, his legacy, crumbled. As you drift through the Tsar's ghostly halls, you hear whispers not of lullabies, but interrogations. The shuffle of boots in the night. The sob of a young boy realizing he must live in his father's shadow, forever. Ivan's portrait, sharp beard, beady eyes, fur-trimmed robes, hangs like a thread above his throne. A man who feared betrayal so much, he ensured his own undoing. A father who killed his legacy with a single blow. And outside, in the cold Moscow night, the bells toll not for celebration, but mourning. Mourning a dynasty that tore itself apart from within. You move from the snowy silence of Moscow to a land where clouds gather low over rain-slicked stone and wind howls through damp courtyards. Scotland, harsh, brooding, and noble in its melancholy. And looming over it all, like a hawk perched on the edge of a crumbling battlement, is James V of Scotland, a king both tragic and tyrannical, and, if you ask his only surviving daughter, utterly absent when it mattered most. Now, you might be thinking, was James really a worst dad? After all, he wasn't known for child murdering or infamous torture chambers. True. But sometimes the failure isn't in violence, it's in neglect. In apathy. In spending more time punishing your enemies than preparing your children to survive the throne you're going to leave them with way too early. James V ruled from 1513 until his death in 1542, ascending the throne when he was just 17 months old, yes, months. His father, James IV, died fighting the English at the Battle of Flodden, a dramatic and ill-fated charge that left the infant James as the world's tiniest monarch, cradled in the chaos of court intrigue. You'd think, having grown up without a father himself, James might have had some sympathy for the weight that could fall on a child king. But when he had a child of his own, he repeated the cycle, except with even less involvement. James married twice, both times politically, of course, and had at least 9 illegitimate children before finally producing a legitimate heir, a baby girl named Mary. You might know her better as Mary, Queen of Scots. She was born on December 8, 1542. James died 6 days later. And here's where it gets bleak. On his deathbed, James is said to have muttered, "It came why, alas, it will gain why, alas." A dark, bitter line referring to how his royal house, Stuart, had come to power through a woman's bloodline, and would now die the same way. Imagine being born into the world with your father basically declaring that your existence is the end of everything. Historians still argue whether James meant this as a curse, a lament, or simply an exhausted observation. But one thing's certain, Mary was crowned queen at just 6 days old, left to the wolves of Regency politics, French influence, Protestant uprisings, and an entire kingdom that did not believe a woman belonged on the throne. Thanks, Dad. But let's rewind a bit. During his life, James was obsessed with punishing nobles he didn't trust. He executed, exiled, and confiscated lands from Scottish lords with ruthless energy. He expanded royal power, but at a cost. He was frequently suspicious, secretive, and so focused on consolidating control that he didn't seem to plan much for what came next. Like, say, a stable succession. Here's a quirky fact. James V had an elaborate collection of musical instruments and maintained a group of court musicians he personally conducted. He was said to have a lovely voice and enjoyed singing with his court, even while plotting against them. Because nothing says, unstable king, like harmonizing with people you're planning to imprison. And yet, he was a deeply religious man. He built monasteries, donated to the poor, and supported church reform, so long as it didn't challenge his power. The contradictions pile up, artistic, but authoritarian. Spiritual, but vengeful. Capable of great charm, but ruled more by mood than reason. James also lost badly at the Battle of Solway Moss just days before Mary was born, a humiliating defeat to the English that shattered his health and spirit. Many think he died less from illness and more from despair. That's not poetic exaggeration. It's a recurring theme in Scottish kingship, defeated in battle, abandoned by nobles, hearts breaking faster than bodies. Now here's a fringe tidbit that doesn't often make the textbooks. Some believe James was already mentally fragile before his final defeat, prone to dark moods and sudden withdrawals from court life. One letter from a court observer describes the king refusing to see his advisors for days, muttering about betrayal and doom. Which brings us back to Mary. James left no letters for her. No instructions. No guardianship plan that stuck. Instead, she was whisked away to France at 5 years old and raised as a royal guest/political bargaining chip. She grew up speaking French, dancing in silk gowns, and praying in Latin, while back in Scotland, the Reformation tore her kingdom apart in her absence. James V, by dying without preparing her, or Scotland, for what came next, effectively handed his daughter a crown made of broken promises. And when she returned as a teenager to rule, it was into a kingdom that barely remembered her and barely wanted her. So no, James V didn't beat his child or exile her to a tower. But he left her something arguably worse, a ticking time bomb of political instability, bitter enemies, and an identity crisis that would follow her all the way to the chopping block in England. You walk now through the halls of Linlithgow Palace, Mary's birthplace. The stone walls are hushed, as though the ghosts of what could have been are still pacing silently. Her father's voice is long gone, but the echo of his absence rings louder than any shout. And somewhere in that cold draft of wind that slips down the stairwell, you hear it. It came why, alas, and it will gang why, alas. You shiver. Not from the cold, but from the weight of those words, 6 days into life, and already carrying the blame for a dying dynasty. The air sharpens now, stinging with salt and the sharp tang of ink and gunpowder. You're on a ship, no, an empire disguised as one, sailing under gold and crimson flags through 16th century Spain. But the man you're here for is not at sea. He's deep in the Escorial Palace, surrounded by shadows and saints, as quiet and cold as the marble beneath his feet. You've entered the world of Philip II of Spain, a king whose empire never saw the setting sun, but whose fatherhood cast some of the darkest shadows of all. Philip II was the son of Charles V, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire in Spain, basically, Europe's busiest man. Charles was hardly the cuddly type himself, but Philip took royal aloofness to a whole new level. Think less dad bod and more God complex. He wasn't explosive like Ivan, nor poetic like Alfonso. He was clinical. A bureaucrat with a crown. And, as it turns out, a deeply tragic figure who may have destroyed his own son out of fear, pride, and maybe, just maybe, love twisted beyond recognition. Let's talk about Don Carlos, Philip's only son from his first wife, Maria of Portugal. Born in 1545, Carlos had the royal pedigree, but not the royal health. He was sickly from birth, his mother died in childbirth, and as he grew, so did his problems. Physically deformed, emotionally unstable, and rumored to be prone to violent fits, Carlos quickly became a source of concern in court. A walking liability with a crown in his future. And Philip? Instead of seeking understanding or support, he turned to silence and distance. He kept his son under control with the same methods he used for rebellious provinces: spying, isolation, and tight surveillance. You know, the classic bedtime story formula. Still, Philip tried, in his own deeply formal way. He arranged tutors, medical care, and advisors. But the real tragedy is this: Philip never seemed to see Carlos as a person. Only as a problem. A dynastic glitch in an otherwise perfect bureaucratic system. Now here's where things take a truly medieval turn. In 1568, Carlos allegedly plotted to flee Spain, possibly to join the rebellious Netherlands or seek support abroad. The details are murky. Historians still argue whether Carlos was actually conspiring or simply losing his grip on reality. But Philip saw enough to act. He arrested his son. Locked him in a cell within the very palace he called home. And then? He never saw him again. Carlos was kept in solitary confinement for 6 months. No visitors. No windows. No trial. He was 23 years old, heir to the Spanish throne, and slowly wasting away behind locked doors while his father prayed in the chapel next door. Eventually, Carlos died. Officially, fever and natural causes. Unofficially, rumors of poison, starvation, or some sinister accident have persisted for centuries. Philip didn't attend the funeral. Instead, he commissioned masses. Dozens. Hundreds. He built altars. Donated to charities. He wore mourning clothes for years. As though penance could substitute for the presents he never gave. And the Spanish people? They were horrified. A wave of sympathy swelled for Don Carlos, turning him into a tragic symbol of royal cruelty. The French wrote plays about him. The Italians composed operas. And Philip's image was sealed, a cold tyrant, more statue than man. A quirky tidbit. Philip II was a micromanager of the highest order. He personally read and responded to thousands of letters, daily. He ruled Spain with the efficiency of a tax accountant and the emotional warmth of a marble bust. He built the Escorial not just as a palace, but as a massive filing cabinet for his soul, church, tomb, residence, library, all neatly arranged, like his thoughts. But even a perfectly catalogued world can't fix a broken relationship. Philip's father, Charles V, had abdicated in favor of monastic peace, retreating into prayer and reflection. Philip. He stayed on the throne, ruling with iron will and prayer beads clenched so tightly they probably left indentations. One fringe theory. Some scholars believe Carlos may have suffered from Habsburg inbreeding-related disorders, mental instability, physical deformities, and perhaps even epilepsy. The dynasty's family tree was more of a wreath by the time Carlos was born. But again, diagnosis isn't defense. Philip had all the power and none of the empathy. He left Carlos to rot in silence, believing it was for the good of Spain. So here you are, walking through the Escorial's long, grey corridors. The stone is cold even in summer. You hear your footsteps echo, and then, nothing. This place absorbs sound the way Philip absorbed grief, quietly, completely, without expression. A heavy wooden door appears before you. It's shut. Behind it, once, was Don Carlos. The lost heir. The cursed son. And behind that door, somewhere deeper, is a man kneeling in prayer, asking for forgiveness he never gave his own child. The man who ruled the world, but couldn't rule his own heart. You leave behind the silence of the Escorial and emerge into flickering torchlight and the low growl of battle chants echoing across stone walls. The air is thick with blood, incense, and steel. You're not just entering another kingdom, you're stepping into a siege. Welcome to the late 12th century, deep in the heart of Jerusalem during the Crusades, where one of the most glorified warriors of the medieval world, Richard the Lionheart, was busy becoming legend, and, at the same time, failing spectacularly as a father. Wait, you might be thinking, Richard had children. Well, that's the thing, technically no legitimate ones. But that doesn't mean he wasn't a father. It means he was one in the worst way, neglectful, disinterested, and entirely too busy waging holy war to secure a legacy that could have avoided an entire civil war back home. Let's unravel it. Richard I of England, born in 1157, was the third son of Henry II, yes, the same Henry from earlier, and Eleanor of Aquitaine. From childhood, Richard was trained for leadership, chivalry, and swordplay. He spent most of his early life in Aquitaine, spoke Occitan better than English, and loved war with an almost theatrical flair. When he finally became king in 1189, he didn't settle in London or reform the tax code. No, he packed his bags and immediately left for the Third Crusade. He was king for 10 years. And he spent less than 6 months of that time in England. You, standing at the edge of Acre's battered walls, watch as Richard storms through the Saracen ranks like a man possessed. He's brave, charismatic, and undeniably lethal. But somewhere, far behind him, his country is collapsing, and he doesn't care. Because Richard the Lionheart doesn't want to rule. He wants to fight. To win. To die gloriously, if need be. And in this ambition, he leaves no room for children. No heirs. No successors. He marries Berengaria of Navarre in 1191, during the Crusade, of course, but the marriage is political. Cold. The two spend almost no time together. She never sets foot in England as queen. And she bears no children. Now, historians still argue whether Richard was uninterested in women or just uninterested in Berengaria. Some suggest he may have been asexual. Others point to intense relationships with male companions like Philip II of France and suggest he may have been homosexual, though these debates are full of speculation and precious little evidence. What's clearer is that he had at least one illegitimate son, named Philip of Cognac, who gets barely a footnote in most chronicles. And here's where the bad dad factor really kicks in. Richard acknowledges Philip of Cognac, but gives him nothing. No lands, no titles, no claim. He's just there. A walking shadow of the Lionheart, drifting through the political periphery. When Richard dies in 1199, from a crossbow wound sustained during a petty siege in France, he leaves no instructions for Philip, no will, and no plan. Just a kingdom teetering on chaos. The throne passes to John, his younger brother. Yes, that John, of Magna Carta infamy, endless rebellions, and being so awful they never reused his name for English kings again. Richard could have changed this. He could have prepared a succession plan, legitimized his son, or even trained him to lead. But he was too busy being a legend to be a father. Too caught up in crusades and campaigns to think about the mess he was creating behind him. Here's a quirky detail: while in Sicily during the crusade, Richard sacked the city of Messina, his own allies, because they insulted Berengaria and his sister Joan. Chivalry, it turns out, was selective. And Berengaria? She would outlive him by decades, living quietly in Le Mans as a near-forgotten widow of a man who never really made room for her in his life. One fringe theory. Some historians believe Richard's reluctance to have children wasn't just political, it was intentional. He knew the Plantagenet line was a viper's nest of betrayal and bloodshed. Perhaps he didn't want to pass that legacy on. Perhaps, in his own way, it was mercy. But that didn't stop the chaos. After his death, England plunged into misrule under King John. The nobles rebelled. The French invaded. The legend of Richard loomed over it all, like a ghost whose armor still gleamed in memory while his realm crumbled in reality. You walk now along the ramparts of Château de Caylus, where Richard took his final breath. The wind rustles the ivy climbing the crumbling stone. Somewhere nearby, a boy named Philip might have stood, wondering if his father would finally summon him. But the call never came. Richard the Lionheart, the Crusader, the icon, the warrior king, left behind songs, statues, and shining armor. But no heir. No closure. No future. Just a silent kingdom. And a forgotten son. The stone path under your feet is uneven now, cracked from centuries of use. You've left the Crusaders' battlefield behind and stepped into a palace so decadent, it feels like a theatrical set built for gods. Velvet drapes, gold-threaded tapestries, mirrors bigger than your entire bedroom, welcome to Versailles, the glittering cage of France's absolute monarchy. And at the center of this gilded dream is Louis XIV, the Sun King. A man who redefined kingship, reshaped France, and may have confused fatherhood with building an empire in his own, blazing image. Louis XIV ruled France from 1643 until 1715, 72 years, the longest reign of any European monarch. He inherited the throne at 4 years old and learned early that a king's job was to dazzle, dominate, and control everything. He succeeded spectacularly at that. But in all his brilliance, he left little room for those closest to him to breathe, especially his children. And there were a lot of them. Louis had 6 legitimate children with his wife, Maria Theresa of Spain. Only one, Louis, Le Grand Dauphin, survived childhood. But Louis didn't stop there. With a series of mistresses, including the famous Madame de Montespan, he fathered at least 14 illegitimate children, many of whom he later legitimized. To the outside world, it looked almost generous, elevating bastards to princely titles. But behind the powdered wigs and elegant smiles was a very different reality. Louis saw his children not as people, but as extensions of his glory. Pieces on a chessboard. Proof of his divine potency. Royal decor. His court was obsessed with ritual and proximity. Where you stood in the king's morning dressing ceremony, or lever, could define your future. And Louis applied the same logic to his children. They were ranked, managed, and positioned like diplomatic assets. Not hugged. Not confided in. Definitely not encouraged to form independent thoughts. Take Louis, the Grand Dauphin. Heir to the throne. Tall, handsome, and disappointing. Louis XIV found him dull, lazy, and politically inept. So he smothered him with ceremony, but never trusted him with real power. He never involved him in meaningful decisions. When advisors suggested letting the Dauphin attend council meetings, Louis brushed it off. He is not yet ready, he'd say, even as the Dauphin aged well into his 30s and 40s. Historians still argue whether this was a calculated move, preserving all power until the end, or simply a father unwilling to see his son as capable. The result? The Dauphin grew passive. Apathetic. He died before ever taking the throne, likely poisoned by court gossip and boredom. Let's talk about one of the illegitimate ones, Louis Auguste, Duke of Maine. Louis XIV adored him as a boy and gave him every advantage, titles, land, military ranks. But again, it wasn't love in the usual sense. It was patronage. And when the political winds shifted under Louis's successor, the Duke was swiftly stripped of everything. Because in Versailles, being the king's son only mattered when the king was still watching. Here's a quirky tidbit: Louis XIV built Versailles not just as a palace, but as a trap. By relocating the nobility from Paris, he could keep them distracted with balls, hunts, and elaborate etiquette. His children lived under the same velvet thumb, always nearby, but rarely embraced. Now here's something strange: Louis did appear to mourn deeply when some of his children died, especially his grandson, the Duke of Burgundy. But even then, the grief felt performative. Controlled. As if he allowed himself emotion only when it matched the grandeur of his image. A fringe theory? Some scholars suggest that Louis's obsession with dynastic control stemmed from the Fronde, a series of civil wars he experienced as a boy, during which the nobility openly rebelled. He spent part of his childhood hiding, unsure if he'd survive. From that trauma, he emerged with a core belief: only absolute control prevents chaos. That belief became policy and parenting style. But control doesn't create connection. By the time Louis died in 1715, he had outlived most of his direct heirs. His son, the Grand Dauphin, was dead. His grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, also dead. His great-grandson, Louis XV, was 5 years old. Just 5. Crowned king like Louis had been, a tiny monarch in a very big chair. So what did Louis leave him? A war-ravaged treasury. An exhausted nobility. And a blueprint for monarchy that prized image over intimacy. It dazzled France for decades, until it all burned down in revolution. You walk now through the Hall of Mirrors, where the chandeliers flicker in your peripheral vision and your footsteps seem to echo forever. This is where Louis danced, ruled, and watched his sons from a distance so vast, even Versailles couldn't bridge it. The palace gleams, but it's hollow. A monument not to family, but to control. The Sun King lit up a continent, but in his own family, he cast long shadows. And behind him, his children wandered, not in awe, but in the cold. The air shifts again, thickening with coal smoke, candle wax, and the faint copper scent of revolution. You're in 18th century Prussia now, no gold-gilded ceilings, no lounging courtiers in lace. Here, the world is made of sharp lines and sharper discipline. Soldiers march in step, officers count grains of sand in their boots, and the king, well, he's probably yelling at someone for blinking wrong. Welcome to the world of Frederick William I, the soldier king, and perhaps one of the most terrifying fathers in European history. This isn't the Frederick you're probably thinking of, not the philosopher king, Frederick the Great. This is his father. The warm-up act. The man who made Prussia a military machine and almost broke his son in the process. Frederick William I ruled from 1713 to 1740, and he ruled like a sergeant major trapped in a monarch's body. He despised luxury. Hated books. Thought art was for cowards and music for weaklings. Instead, he obsessed over giant soldiers, tax ledgers, and drill manuals. And what did he want more than anything? For his son, his poor, poetic, sensitive son, to be just like him. Spoiler, it did not go well. Frederick the future great was born in 1712 and spent his childhood being molded like a block of granite into something his father could salute. His toys were taken away and replaced with tiny weapons. He was woken at dawn for drills. His every move was watched. He wasn't allowed to speak French at home, too fancy. Music lessons. Barely tolerated. Books. Suspicious. But Frederick had a mind like quicksilver, and he craved poetry, philosophy, and art. He wanted to discuss Voltaire, not goose-step in a courtyard. Tensions exploded in 1730. At just 18 years old, Frederick tried to escape, literally. He hatched a plan with a friend, Hans Hermann von Katt, to flee to England, away from his father's iron grip. But they were caught. Frederick William, humiliated and enraged, had his son arrested. Stripped of titles. Imprisoned. And then, brace yourself, he forced Frederick to watch the execution of his friend. Von Katt was beheaded outside Frederick's prison window. The prince fainted. Some say he never fully recovered. Historians still argue whether Frederick William believed this would toughen up his son or whether it was simply vengeance cloaked in paternal concern. Either way, it was trauma with a capital T. And yet, it worked, sort of. Frederick eventually conformed. He played the role. He took the throne in 1740. But he never forgot. A quirky fact. Despite his cruelty, Frederick William I was obsessed with his regiment of giant soldiers. He had agents scouring Europe for especially tall men, paying absurd amounts to recruit or even buy them. He arranged marriages between tall couples, hoping for tall children. It was like the world's most disturbing basketball draft, except in wigs and tricorn hats. Meanwhile, his actual son. Barely 6 feet. Not tall enough. Not loyal enough. Not obedient enough. In the king's eyes, a failure. Yet the irony. When Frederick the Great finally became king, he turned out to be everything his father wasn't: cultured, diplomatic, brilliant at war and letters. He played flute sonatas, debated Enlightenment thinkers, and still managed to expand Prussia's borders. His reign was a triumph of intelligence and tolerance, qualities his father had tried to beat out of him. And what did Frederick think of his father after all that? When Frederick William died in 1740, his son buried him with full military honors. He even kept a portrait of him in his palace. But later in life, he referred to him as a brutal drill sergeant, and admitted that most of his reign was an attempt to fix what his father had ruined. One fringe theory. Some biographers believe that Frederick William suffered from mental illness, perhaps bipolar disorder, or severe anxiety masked by aggression. His fits of rage were often followed by deep remorse. But in a palace run like a barracks, there was no space for therapy. Just discipline. Always more discipline. You walk now through the halls of the Potsdam Palace, where Frederick once played flute solos alone in the dark. The wallpaper here is austere, no gold trim, just clean lines and order. There's a stiffness in the very air. And you can almost hear the ghost of the soldier king pacing in the next room, barking orders to invisible troops, still trying to straighten the world around him. But in the quiet corners of this fortress, the whispers are not of military glory. They are of a son. Sitting alone. Mourning a friend. And trying to love a father who never once said, "I'm proud of you." The wind's calm now, but the tension doesn't lift. You're in England again, late 15th century this time, standing beneath the shadow of the Tower of London. The sky presses low, grey and swollen, like it knows what's about to happen. The streets are quieter than usual. It's as if the stones themselves are holding their breath. You're here to witness one of the most haunting royal failures of all time, the story of Richard III, the last Plantagenet king, and the man accused of ordering the murder of his own nephews, the infamous princes in the Tower. Now, full disclosure, technically, Richard III wasn't a father to these boys. But he was their uncle, guardian, and Lord Protector, the man entrusted to guide and protect them after their father, Edward IV, died. And what he did, or may have done, to them puts him on any list of terrible, surrogate, or substitute fathers in medieval history. Let's begin in April 1483. Edward IV dies unexpectedly. His eldest son, Edward V, is just 12. By law and custom, the boy should become king immediately, with his uncle Richard acting as regent until he comes of age. And at first, Richard plays the part. He escorts young Edward to London, lodges him safely in the Tower, which, back then, wasn't yet a symbol of death, but a royal residence. Then Edward's younger brother, Richard of Shrewsbury, joins him. Two boys in royal robes. Young. Vulnerable. Crowned by blood but not yet by ceremony. And then, they disappear. Weeks pass. No coronation. No public appearances. No letters from the princes. And then Richard, the uncle, claims the throne for himself. He becomes Richard III, saying that his nephews were illegitimate due to some shady technicality about their father's marriage. Historians still argue whether this was cold-hearted ambition or an attempt to stabilize a fracturing kingdom. Some believe Richard truly thought he was the better choice for England. Others believe it was pure, brutal opportunism. But what happened to the boys? That's the part that cements Richard's reputation. According to most accounts, though none contemporary and many politically motivated, the princes were murdered in the Tower sometime in 1483. Some say Richard gave the order directly. Others point fingers at the Duke of Buckingham, or even Henry Tudor's supporters, attempting to discredit Richard later. But the truth? No one knows for sure. One thing is certain, the boys vanished. And Richard never produced them. Never paraded them through the streets to prove they were safe. Never even acknowledged the rumors swirling like vultures above his crown. Even if he didn't order their deaths, he failed them. He failed to protect them. Failed to preserve their names. Failed to act like anything resembling a father figure. And if that's not a cautionary tale about power and guardianship, what is? Here's a quirky detail. In 1674, two small skeletons were discovered in the Tower during renovations. They were buried in a wooden chest beneath a staircase. Believed to be the princes, they were moved to Westminster Abbey and reinterred. No definitive DNA testing has ever been allowed, despite modern capabilities. Their identities, and the truth, remain sealed in stone. Richard III, meanwhile, fought and died at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, defeated by Henry Tudor, who would become Henry VII, starting the Tudor dynasty. Richard's crown was found on a thorn bush. His body was tossed in a ditch. History, thanks largely to Shakespeare, remembered him as a hunchbacked villain, desperate and damned. And yet, Richard wasn't without complexity. He implemented legal reforms, supported the poor, even banned illegal property seizures. He wasn't a cartoon. He was a man. One who made choices, possibly monstrous ones, with consequences that echoed for generations. A fringe theory. Some historians argue the boys may have died naturally, of illness, and Richard kept it quiet to avoid political chaos. Others suggest they were quietly exiled or imprisoned and died later under someone else's reign. All possibilities. None comforting. You walk now through the tower's cold corridors, your fingers trailing along the stone walls. The rooms are small. Claustrophobic. You reach a tiny chamber near the White Tower, where it's said the boys last lived. There's no furniture now. Just dust and silence. But you can almost feel it, the uncertainty. The confusion. The betrayal. Two boys waiting for their coronation, not knowing their uncle might have already taken everything. And above them, outside these walls, a kingdom too eager to forget. Richard was no father. But he was entrusted to act like one. And in that trust, he left a stain that no crown could ever polish clean. You tread now through corridors steeped in velvet shadows and scandal, this time, not in a windswept castle or a drafty stone fortress, but in a palace built for secrets and silver-tongued politics. Welcome to early 19th century Vienna, where chandeliers drip crystal and musicians tune their strings in the salons of empire. But we're not here for a waltz. We're here to meet one last man in our parade of appalling patriarchs, Francis II, Holy Roman Emperor, later Francis I of Austria, a ruler who turned fatherhood into a policy of fear, surveillance, and spiritual suffocation. Francis II ruled during a time of revolutionary fever. The world had just watched the French monarchy behead itself. Napoleon was storming across Europe. Chaos reigned. And what did Francis do in response? He clamped down on everything, including his own children. Now, let's focus on one in particular, his daughter, Marie-Louise. Born in 1791, she grew up in a Europe already unraveling. Her earliest memories were of her family fleeing from French armies. Of maps changing shape weekly. Of paintings being hurriedly taken off the walls before invaders arrived. And then, just as the dust seemed to settle, her father handed her over, to Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who had humiliated Austria, dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, and crowned himself emperor in defiance of everything Francis stood for. In 1810, at just 18 years old, Marie-Louise was married off to Napoleon in a brutally strategic union. Her father didn't consult her. He didn't care that she despised the man. She was told, point blank, this is your duty. Smile. Wave. Be fruitful. To Francis, Marie-Louise wasn't a daughter. She was a pawn on the diplomatic chessboard. A symbol of peace. Or at least, temporary truce. The marriage, surprisingly, wasn't a complete horror show, at least not initially. Napoleon, perhaps exhausted by years of conquest and loss, was gentler with her than many expected. She bore him a son, Napoleon II, whom Bonaparte adored. But when Napoleon's empire collapsed just 4 years later, everything turned cold again. And what did Francis do then? Did he welcome his daughter home? Yes. Sort of. But not her child. The young Napoleon II, Marie-Louise's son, was taken from her. Raised in Austria under tight supervision. Kept apart from his mother. Given a new name, Franz, Duke of Reichstadt. Even his French tutors were dismissed. He was told repeatedly that he was Austrian now. That his father had been a tyrant. That he must forget who he was. Francis essentially erased the boy's identity. Historians still debate whether this was a genuine attempt to protect him or a cold-blooded strategy to prevent any chance of a Bonaparte resurgence. Either way, it was emotional exile. The child grew up caught between two legacies, one glorified, one vilified, neither truly his own. He died at 21 of tuberculosis. Alone. Disillusioned. A shadow of the empire both his grandfather and his father had built and destroyed. Let's go back to Francis, though. You might ask, wasn't he just doing what rulers had to do in unstable times? Perhaps. But Francis's paranoia extended far beyond politics. He created one of Europe's most oppressive surveillance states. He funded an extensive network of informants. He banned entire categories of books. His own children were watched, measured, kept close, but emotionally distant. They were never truly allowed to flourish, only to follow. Here's a quirky fact: despite being deeply conservative and repressive, Francis loved theater. He often attended operas and plays, provided they were censored, of course, and fancied himself a kind of benevolent patriarch, smiling from the imperial box as the crowd applauded. Off-stage, however, the script was rigid. The family must conform. The empire must endure. Feeling had no place in the imperial schedule. Francis's parenting style. Imagine a mix of helicopter parenting and Cold War surveillance. His letters to his children read less like affection and more like performance reviews. And if anyone stepped out of line, even slightly, there were consequences. Marriages denied. Education redirected. Friends dismissed. One fringe theory. Some scholars argue Francis suffered from a deep-rooted psychological insecurity, a kind of post-revolutionary PTSD. Watching monarchs fall and guillotines rise may have convinced him that love was weakness, and control was safety. Unfortunately, that trauma became inherited, not genetically, but atmospherically, passed down like a choking fog over his descendants. You wander now through the Hofburg Palace, where the marble floors gleam too brightly and the doors close just a little too softly. Portraits of children line the hallways, rosy cheeks, velvet suits, blank expressions. Marie-Louise is there, looking away from the canvas. And further down, the young Duke of Reichstadt, dressed as a soldier, playing a role in a war he never fought. Francis may have preserved his empire, for a while. But at the cost of trust. Of family. Of hearts that needed more than politics to survive. In the end, he wasn't the father of a dynasty. He was the warden of one. And as the chandeliers dim and the whispers fade, you realize this journey isn't just about bad dads. It's about the damage done when power trumps presence. When titles matter more than tenderness. When kings forget they were sons once, too. Now, take a breath. The halls are quiet now. The thrones are empty. The crowns are gathering dust on velvet pillows in locked glass cases. The wars are over, the letters have stopped, and the voices, those shouting monarchs and whispering heirs, have all faded to echoes. You've walked through centuries tonight, haven't you? Through cold palaces, iron cages, gold-gilded lies, and heartbreaking silences. You've seen fathers fail in public and in private. Fail with rage. Fail with neglect. Fail by trying too hard, or not enough. And now, in this final hush, the world slows down. You sit beneath a painted ceiling, the kind that stretches far overhead, heaven just out of reach. Maybe there's a flickering candle nearby. Maybe you hear a clock ticking faintly in some other room. This story is over now. You're not a prince. Not a soldier. Not a child waiting in a tower. But you've listened, closely, and carried all of it, quietly. And for that, thank you. Let your breath soften. Let the noise of these ancient ghosts fall away. You are not in Versailles. Or the Kremlin. Or a Prussian fortress. You're here. Safe. Still. Drift now. There's nothing more to fix. Nothing more to chase. Just stillness. And sleep. Good night.